Hi, my name is Kristina. I'm a researcher with Lookout's Threat Intelligence team, and I'm really excited to be here today at my favorite conference to talk about the surveillance campaigns that we've encountered at Lookout, spanning roughly 8 years, targeting Uyghurs within China as well as abroad. Next slide, please. One more. Thank you. So I want to start off by talking about these 5 groups that you see on the screen. They are collectively called the 5 poisons. And these groups are considered by the Chinese Communist Party to basically threaten the stability of the state and of the regime. They include practitioners of Falun Gong, Chinese democracy supporters, advocates for Taiwan's independence, and then Tibetan and Uyghur separatists. And as I've researched these groups as part of our threat hunting activities, there's kind of the same statement that comes up again and again and again from different scholars. And that is that the reason why these groups are considered such a threat is because they don't just have political activism presence in China, but also significant presence outside of China. And presumably, because of this reason, a number of individuals tied to these groups, even if they themselves are not political activists, have been targeted by pretty extensive CCP intelligence operations. And next slide, please. This takes us to our discussion specifically about Uyghurs and the campaigns that we have seen. So the reason why I'm specifically talking about the Uyghur population is because Uyghur surveillance campaigns are by far the most prolific campaigns that we've encountered at Lookout. And specifically, what makes these interesting is that we're seeing Uyghurs targeted not just within China, but extensive targeting outside the region, especially in Turkey. And this actually overlaps with some of the testimony we've seen from people living outside of China who have moved from Xinjiang to Turkey, and the broader Uyghur diaspora in Turkey who have been targeted by extensive PRC operations in an attempt to suppress political activism. This often takes the form of blackmail, so usually intimidation, or sometimes even cases where family members have been detained and held hostage back in Xinjiang. Next slide, please. And so kind of the bulk of the context for our story around the Uyghur surveillance issue is centered in Xinjiang. The official name is the Uyghur Autonomous Region of Xinjiang. It's a region in the northwesternmost part of China, just north of Tibet. And it's actually quite large. It's larger than Alaska. And for those of us who are Canadian, it's larger than the province of Quebec. And it is home to over 56 different ethnic groups, the largest being Uyghurs, Han, Kazakh, and Hui. What makes this area particularly interesting, and I think what provides a lot of context into the actions from the government, is the fact that it is responsible for producing 20% of China's oil and gas, as well as a significant portion of coal production. And it produces 1/4 of the world's tomatoes and cotton. Next slide, please. And so presumably because of this, because of the impact it has on China's overall energy production, as well as the other resources that make it economically important, over the past few decades, the government has really attempted to exert its control on this region. Now, not surprisingly, this has led to political unrest in the area and the subsequent creation of what the government calls re-education camps as part of a campaign to curb religious extremism and terrorism. But what we've learned from the work of numerous scholars, as well as leaked documents and testimony from former detainees, is that Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minority groups within Xinjiang have been sent to these camps en masse. Experts estimate this began in 2014 and then intensified in 2017. And since 2017, there have been roughly 1.5 million people detained in these camps, the majority being Uyghur. It's often described by scholars as the largest detainment of a population based on ethnicity or religion since World War II. And despite the fact that the government is sort of trying to position these camps as glorified boarding schools, there have been significant reports of abuse, of forced sterilization, as part of a campaign that's been called the No Illegal Births Policy in Xinjiang, as well as reports of forced labor. Next slide, please. Now, there are also some really interesting documents that were leaked that are now collectively called the Xinjiang police files that really highlight the ways that people might lead to being sent to one of these camps. And they kind of also highlight how little you might do in order to actually be sent to a re-education camp. Next slide, please. A lot of these activities are coined pre-criminal activities, and this is basically a way of saying that you've done something that either makes the government think that you are prone to religious extremism or that you might one day become a problem for state stability. And these are things that I think most of us do, things like using a VPN, in many cases attending a mosque on a Friday, attending a mosque a certain number of times. The number I usually see is over 200 times. Using third-party messaging applications, receiving a message from somebody who might be on a watch list, or receiving religious texts from somebody on a watch list, looking at religious texts on your mobile device. There was one woman who was sent to the camps for the combination of at one point wearing a hijab, even if she didn't still wear it, using WhatsApp at some point, and visiting Kazakhstan at one point. Next slide, please. And so this takes us to our discussion about mobile surveillance in particular, because, quite frankly, with everything that we do on our phones, and especially with how important smartphones and WeChat have become in China, if you want to know what somebody is doing and you want to see whether they're engaging in any of these so-called pre-criminal activities, one of the best ways to do this is to compromise their smartphone, right? You can see everything pretty much. You can see what apps they're using, you can see who they're talking to, you can see what content they viewed, what content they've downloaded, and you can access a lot of other, kind of potentially damning information that the government might be able to use to justify sending somebody to one of these detention centers. Next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So at Lookout, we've been tracking these campaigns for, like I said, roughly 8 years. And as you can see from this timeline, there is a lot of Uyghur targeted surveillance floating around on the internet. Now, the numbers that the dates that you're seeing, these correspond to when we first saw a sample of this particular family. And then there has been a lot of work from other research teams doing phenomenal disclosures about different Uyghur surveillance families that they've seen targeting mobile devices as well. And I have a whole list of these in one of the last slides, but you can see the teams with their corresponding malware family on this timeline as well. But what we've seen, really, is that the earliest sample of Uyghur surveillance dates back to 2011. And this is a family called Golden Eagle. We wrote about this in a white paper that was released in 2020. But basically from 2011 all the way to today, we're seeing a significant development in the number of new surveillance applications that are being used to target this population. And if you look at the timeline, pretty much every year there are new samples popping up. Now you'll see a couple of samples here, Mobile Hunter and NetGuard. I've included these because they are surveillance applications, but these are actually state developed. So they don't necessarily fall into the campaigns we've seen where you have Trojanized applications being distributed in an attempt to compromise someone's device without knowing. Many of these applications are used at various checkpoints in Xinjiang to essentially do forensics on someone's phone and see what they've been doing. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So today, the two we're going to focus on are two malware families that we have seen extensively distributed through various social media platforms and forums. The first is Moonshine, and this is a surveillance kit that was discovered by Citizen Lab in 2019. In that context, it was used as part of a spear phishing attack against Tibetan activists. Somebody would receive a text message saying, hey, look at this great article, and an exploit would be delivered to their device, and then the Moonshine surveillance kit would be downloaded and run in the background without them realizing, collecting a whole bunch of information. How we're seeing it now is actually embedded within various Android applications and then being distributed through social media platforms. The other family we're going to look at is a new one. This is a family called Bad Bazaar that we've called Bad Bazaar. And this family is literally on every single Uyghur language Telegram channel that I've come across. It's quite prolific in its distribution. Next slide, please. So how are these apps getting distributed? There are a few ways. So as I mentioned from the Citizen Lab report, there was the spear phishing attack against Tibetan activists. So spear phishing is certainly one very effective way that these apps are being delivered. Where I've particularly been seeing these apps show up is through two main vectors. The first being extensive social engineering on Uyghur language social media platforms. A lot of various Telegram channels of people asking for different apps that they can't access because they're behind the Great Firewall and need to be able to reach family through Telegram or WhatsApp or whatever. And so somebody might post a request saying, hey, I'm looking for a cracked version of WhatsApp that I can use. And you'll have a few people that will respond that have sort of, I guess, gained the trust and the support of people within the community by engaging with people over a course of sometimes several months. They'll respond and say, hey, this is the version that I use, it's great. And of course, we look at it, and it's Bad Bazaar, or it's Moonshine. And so there are these pretty extensive and long-running social engineering campaigns on some of these different platforms. The other way we're seeing these apps distributed, specifically in the case of Bad Bazaar, is through either fake app stores, where the threat actor has created an app store just to download Uyghur language applications to someone's device, claiming that they're all benign, but they actually are all distributing different variants of the Bad Bazaar surveillanceware, or sometimes through unofficial, but the quote-unquote legitimate third-party app stores like APK Pure. Next slide, please. So we've been looking at a number of applications that we've seen through various social media platforms and forums that are used by Uyghur language netizens, I guess for lack of a better word. And of these samples that we've collected from July of this year, 30% of them were surveillanceware. Of those, 62% are this new family Bad Bazaar, 25% were Moonshine, and the remainder were some older families that we've talked about kind of in the past that have been tied to Uyghur surveillance campaigns. One of them, Double Agent, is part of that white paper from 2020, and that comes back when we talk a little bit about attribution on Bad Bazaar. And then the other two that we've seen specifically targeting the Uyghur population are Henbox and Plugin Phantom. And both of these are pretty old families that were discovered by Unit 42 a few years ago. The 5.5% number there is related to commercial surveillanceware that's not specifically used in every case to target Uyghurs, but has been repurposed for the sake of these Uyghur campaigns. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So starting off with Bad Bazaar, we came across a sample of Bad Bazaar from a Twitter handle called Malware Hunter Team. They tend to share a lot of interesting samples on Twitter. And this had been flagged by VirusTotal as a family called Bahamut. And when we looked at it, it was pretty clear that this was not the same threat actor, not the same malware family. It was actually tied to a Uyghur targeting campaign, and we inevitably found out that it was related to an APT group called APT-15. And what we found was that there was targeting with this malware family, not just of Uyghurs in China, but also abroad. There was a device in Turkey that had been compromised, as well as any countries that had significant Muslim populations. Afghanistan was another one. Now, these applications typically take the form of either being custom fake app stores, like I mentioned, that are attempting to download additional Bad Bazaar samples to someone's device, or they're using legitimate applications like TikTok and Trojanizing them with the Bad Bazaar malware. Of these samples of Bad Bazaar that we have in our data set, 70% of them came from social media, and specifically Uyghur language social media platforms. Next slide, please. So the way that Bad Bazaar works is the actual application doesn't really contain much malicious functionality. What it does is it reaches out to its C2, grabs the payload that actually contains the surveillance capabilities, and then runs it dynamically on the device. There were some early variants that bundled the surveillance capability within a file called update.jar, but they quickly pivoted away from that because it's a very easy way to be caught, especially if you have some kind of antivirus software running on your phone. Assets is where everyone hides the scary good stuff. So they've pivoted away from that, and now they're specifically pulling down the payload from their C2. Next slide, please. And the malware is actually pretty full-featured. It can collect almost everything about your device. location, installed applications, call logs, including geocoded data for those calls, SMS messages, information tied to certain third-party applications that can be specified by the C2. It can look for, say, Word documents or PowerPoint files that are stored on your device. It can record your phone calls, it can take pictures, it can basically see everything that you're doing with your phone at all times. Next slide, please. So the infrastructure for Bad Bazaar is actually pretty recognizable, and it's very consistent across all of the variants that we've looked at. Unlike some of the other malware families we see that are a little bit less, for lack of a better word, sophisticated, they're using SSL pinning to try and prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. However, they are using, at least in the most recent variants, the same certificates across all of the different samples. And they're all included in the resources. There's a directory called raw within the APK package. They also all have the same common name, my server. But because they're reusing these certificates, we have seen them across various C2s. But the actual infrastructure fingerprint looks like this. They have a domain where they use a subdomain that is 3 or 4 characters, typically corresponding to the application that they've Trojanized. So let's say if you have Telegram, it could be something like tel.a-series-of-random-letters.com. Those domains are always registered with enum, and the newest variants for the actual C2 communications are using only 2 ports, 20121 or 20122. And all of the infrastructure has been hosted by Hetzner. Next slide, please. So what do we know so far about who might be behind this threat in particular? So I mentioned double agent a little while ago, and again, this was a family that we talked about in a 2020 white paper. And one of the Bad Bazaar samples that we have actually overlaps with infrastructure during the same time frame as a double agent sample that we have. So we know that the threat actor tied to Bad Bazaar is likely also responsible for at least part of the distribution of the double agent malware. We've also seen the use of what appears to be a digital quartermaster for registering and basically distributing the C2 infrastructure. One in particular is this email address, wangminghua6@gmail.com, and they have been tied to other long-running Chinese surveillance campaigns, in particular those attributed to APT-15, who we connected the double agent malware to in 2020. Next slide, please. One more slide, thank you. So now on to Moonshine. As I mentioned, what we're seeing now with Moonshine are these kind of like application-based distributed versions of the surveillanceware. And how this application works, it's quite interesting. Early variants, they basically just bundled Moonshine within a Trojanized app, asked for every permission under the sun, and sent it out into the world. They've gotten cleverer now because they know that most people are a little bit wary about a dictionary that asks to be able to read your call logs. So they've changed things wherein they use kind of like a vulnerability score for a device. So let's say that you get an application, you think it's WhatsApp, but it's actually a Trojanized version of WhatsApp with Moonshine. And because WhatsApp asks for a number of different legitimate permissions that it needs to let you interact with the application, you grant it permission to your photos, your videos, your contacts, basically everything under the sun. What Moonshine does is it goes through and it looks at all of the permissions that you have granted, and based on the permissions that it has access to, it creates a score for your device, sends that score to the C2, and based on that information, the C2 decides what commands it will send to your device and what data it will try to exfiltrate. Next slide, please. The actual Moonshine surveillance kit operates pretty similarly to what we saw in 2019 from Citizen Lab's report. It uses a native library file that used to be called libbourbon.so and is now called libout. And this is responsible for extracting a payload called Scotch and setting the C2 information that gets passed to the Scotch module. Then what Scotch does is it takes the C2 information and downloads, at this point, 4 additional modules. Initially, it was, I believe, only 2. We're at a point where we have 4 now. And those additional modules, in combination with Scotch, all perform the surveillance capabilities used by the application on the device. And all of these details, as well as the C2 information, is encrypted and stored in a file with this file name, exclusively this file name. They really like to reuse it. Next slide. So, like any good surveillanceware, Moonshine is quite full-featured as well. It allows you to do call recording on the device, collect contact information, getting files that are specified by the C2, accessing photos, accessing specific folders, microphone recording. And what's also really interesting is in one of the most recent packages, or the recent modules that we've seen that we hadn't previously seen until about October of this year, they're now starting to collect WeChat databases from the device. Next slide. So where this also gets kind of interesting is that the infrastructure that's used by the Moonshine campaign is very similar, again, to what we saw in 2019. They have these administrative panels that presumably, if you could log in, would actually collect all of the device information and display it to whoever has access. And they all have the same title, Scotch admin. In 2019, sometimes you'd see a whiskey admin or a bourbon admin, but now they're sticking with Scotch. And we were able to see some victim device information by a misconfigured API endpoint at the various C2s that we had access to. You couldn't really see anything about identifying who these victims were, but you could see an alias of the device, you could see when they were compromised, how recently they'd been compromised, and the whiskey ID that was used to basically identify the device. So from that, we know that there are over 635 devices that have been compromised by this surveillanceware. Next slide, please. In terms of attribution, Moonshine has been attributed to the threat actor group Poison Carp. From what we've seen on these samples, we're pretty certain at this point that they're a Chinese threat actor based on a few indicators. The first being that within the source code, they do a couple of checks to see if you have network connectivity. And the first thing they look for is whether you can connect to Baidu, basically the Google of China. And the second thing they do is try and connect to a Chinese IP address. So this wouldn't necessarily be definitive for us to say for certain that these are Chinese threat actors, but then we were able to access API documentation for their administrative web app, and all of this is written in simplified Chinese. The fingerprint for this infrastructure, again, is pretty consistent. They're using free DDNS services to host their domains. All of the infrastructure is hosted in Singapore, and most are hosted by Hostinger International. Next slide, please. One more slide, thank you. So what do we know about threat actors tied to all of these various Uyghur surveillance campaigns? I think all of us know in this room, attribution is really hard. So we do know a few things about some of the companies that have been tied to some of the previous malware families that we've encountered. And I'm just referencing this slide because I think it's a handy way of understanding the convention for naming Chinese businesses. So basically how it works is you have your registered location, you have a chosen name, you have what the company does, and the company type. And this first example is the company we're going to talk about, Beijing Best United Technology Company Limited. Next slide, please. So this company was attributed to Plugin Phantom by Meta, and it's a really interesting company in that it is very small. They only have 3 insured employees, and they're also quite proud of their connections to various surveillance of the Xinjiang region, in particular in China. They regularly post contracts that they've won, especially for forensics tools that are used by the Xinjiang prosecutor's office. And they even have a particular page on their site that details what the surveillanceware does. So they are an OSINT researcher's dream. Next slide, please. The next company we know about was tied to Golden Eagle. And again, this is an older family from our 2020 white paper. And this company is actually a large defense contractor based in Xi'an that we were able to connect to this malware family based on an open admin panel that contained a bunch of GPS data for various test devices. And all of the GPS data for these test devices were kind of concentrated in the Xi'an area, and especially in the location for the Xi'an Tianhe Defense Technology Company Limited. Kind of like Best, the company that we just talked about, they're quite keen on sharing the awards they've won for their contribution to surveillance operations in Xinjiang, and their website is also full of very interesting information. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have one other company that has been tied to this Golden Eagle family in the same area. They're also in Xi'an, and they're called Astronomical Point Network Technology Company. And we were able to connect them to Golden Eagle because they actually registered a couple of the domains that were used for C2s. If you look at the image here at the very, very top, the screenshot, that is their name and pinyin, as well as a variation of their address. And they're actually just located down the road from the defense contractor, and they also have employees that are quite keen to share screenshots of the work they've done on surveillance tooling while working at the company. What I think makes this company really interesting and something that's worth noting is that while they don't necessarily share as much content on their website or talk about the contracts they've won, they have published a few tools that they describe as kind of software developments and innovation. And one of them is called a minority language intelligent recognition and translation system. And I think this is noteworthy because in kind of the early days of smartphone use in Xinjiang, it was pretty common for Uyghurs to share voice memos and other audio or video recordings rather than typing in Uyghur because there wasn't a lot of support for the script. And it was also a good way to kind of circumvent the government's censorship laws. And so having a service like this that would allow you to detect certain languages of minority groups was pretty instrumental in changing the ways that the government implemented censorship laws in the region. Next slide, please. One more slide, thank you. So where does this leave us now? What are we seeing with these newer campaigns? We're seeing a few things. The first being that, again, for lack of a better word, these campaigns and the malware that are connected to them seem to be a bit more sophisticated than what we've seen previously. Sometimes we'll come across mobile surveillanceware that is not really operational. They haven't kept a lot of the real functionality of the application they're pretending to be intact. So you'll load something on your device, it won't really do much, or it'll say, sorry, your phone's too old, we need to uninstall this. And it's pretty clear at that point that you've been compromised. So we're not really seeing that here. We're seeing fully functional tools, real working dictionaries, real versions of Telegram or WhatsApp that have been modified to download this surveillanceware. We're also seeing these extensive social engineering campaigns with people representing the threat actors who are very entrenched in these communities and gaining trust and then pretty effectively sharing the applications that are this malicious content. So there's one case where somebody shares a mapping application that has Bad Bazaar in it, and the person replies and says, oh, thanks so much, but you know what, for some reason it's not loading on my phone, can you send me something else? And the person sends 3 other different applications that are all Bad Bazaar. So there has been a lot of trust that's been gained by basically infiltrating these communities for longer periods of time. And then we're just seeing better secured infrastructure. With the exception of that endpoint we were able to access, the infrastructure that we've seen for Bad Bazaar and Moonshine is quite well secured. What we pretty much expect at this point to see in the future is the level of sophistication around these campaigns to grow. Especially with a lot of international pressure around the issue of Uyghur surveillance in Xinjiang and the software vulnerability disclosure law, which has already led to the use of more 0 days by the state. We anticipate that we're going to be seeing progressively more sophisticated campaigns targeting these populations. Next slide, please. So I just want to leave us with this quote. This is a quote from a really phenomenal book called In the Camps by Darren Byler. And it's something that kind of struck me while I've been working on this research for roughly a year. It's sort of a nice reminder about the work that we're doing having a real impact on people. And yeah, I just wanted to leave that with you. Next slide, please. I also want to give a huge shout out to a number of researchers who are either still at Lookout or have left and moved elsewhere, who are part of the research across the various campaigns that we've investigated, as well as some of the research into Moonshine and Bad Bazaar. Next slide, please. And I'm going to share these slides on Twitter or Mastodon, wherever. So if anybody's interested in learning more about the various disclosures, one more slide, please. As well as a bunch of references to some of the things that I've talked about, please take a look at those. One more slide. And for anyone interested in learning more about these issues, I highly recommend these books, as well as a few links here that can kind of give you some insight into what's happening in the region. Thank you so much.
So a question for you. When it comes to the religious aspect of the Uyghurs who are being detained and everything, what's the reason behind that? Because I was looking it up and everything, and much of the religions that they participate in are more peaceful religions. So it was just didn't totally make sense why they were doing that.
So I'm not a scholar on this issue. I think there's probably much more than what I can explain. But from my understanding, the rationale that's been given for the religious minorities that have been kind of rounded up and sent off to these camps has been tied to mostly Muslims that aren't themselves actually extremists or involved in political activism, but because of the climate post 9/11, there has just been this kind of insurgence of Islamophobia in the region, and because the majority of people living in Xinjiang who are part of these ethnic minority groups are practicing Muslims, or at least their culture is closely tied to Islam, it's I think sort of why the CCP has particularly cracked down on this region, or sorry, on this population. And then also because kind of in the early days of the CCP trying to exert their control over Xinjiang and perhaps ensure that they had control over the resources that were being extracted from the region, there were a fair number of political outcries, I can't think of another word. There were some terrorist attacks, and so a lot of that has been used as a justification for these camps. If that answers your question.
All right, one more over here. Thank you. I just had a brief question. I think when you mentioned the Trojanized applications, did you see any applications that they would Trojanize that may be of interest to the Uyghurs? Prayer applications or applications that would text their native language?
Oh, yes. The vast majority, I should say. So there are, a lot of popular third-party tools that have been Trojanized, but the bulk of what we see are either Uyghur language dictionaries, prayer applications, sometimes very specific mapping applications tied to Turkey that are all written in Uyghur, and those have been extensively Trojanized and redistributed with the malware.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.